the EU over this issue has taken on a lot of responsibility for deciding what, up until relatively recently, would have been considered much more of a kind of a national question as to where you get your energy from. And through this issue, the EU's taken on a huge amount of power to decide and determine these kind of core questions of energy security.
The European defense industrial base is starting to ramp up and has increased over the past years, but is nowhere near the capacity nor the ability to commit in the way that the American defense sector is. So there is a reading which is floated here around in Brussels and many European capitals that the position that the European Commission, as opposed to the Parliament, has taken is to stick to the deal to maintain the Trump administration on board with the military support for Ukraine.
I think this malaise, it's more common among the Western nations. And definitely there would be the fact of that for a very long time we were told that this is really bad to be attached to your nation, to your country. All wars are bad. Even the defense war is bad. So I don't think this is a huge surprise that this is the case.
So hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels Podcast. As ever, I'm Jacob Reynolds, and this week on the podcast, we're going to be taking a look at Hungary's block of aid that the EU wants to send to Ukraine. We're going to take a look at the latest decision from the Supreme Court in the United States and whether that impacts the US-EU trade deal. And finally, we're going to take a look at some interesting, and you might say dangerous proposals to beef up the European defense industry and European armies by using migrants. Joining me on the podcast this week, I'm delighted to welcome back Agnieszka Kolek, our Head of Cultural Engagement.
Thank you for having me.
And delighted to welcome back to the podcast Philipp Siegert, our Deputy Research Director.
Hi.
So, the kicking off this week has been a huge storm in Brussels, I think it's fair to say, over the announcement of Viktor Orbán and Hungary that they're going to be blocking the latest aid package that the EU wants to send to Ukraine that had previously been agreed and Hungary secured an opt-out from, and in addition, various measures on new sanctions that the EU wants to do. And the origins of all of this is a dispute between Hungary and Ukraine over the transit of Russian oil through Ukraine. Now, there's been a lot of kind of he said, she said over this issue. And if you were to read only the mainstream presses or the pro-EU presses, you'd kind of be mistaken for thinking that this is just another example of Viktor Orbán, who so pro-Russia, hates Ukraine, determined to kind of stand in the way of anything that the EU wants to do with regards to helping Ukraine, in this case, a 90 billion package of loans and other financial assistance. But Philip, what is Hungary's justification for this? Because according to Hungary, it's not quite as simple as them just obviously being the kind of big bad guys, but they have a very specific justification for what's going on.
So the Hungarian explanation for the stance that the government has now taken goes back to January and the stop of the flow of oil through the Druzhba pipeline to Hungary. For context, the Hungarian strategic reserves are about 3 months. So this is 1 month ago. 1 month of those reserves is now already depleted. And the Hungarian government has come to the conclusion that the best way forward will be to, in a way, apply maximum pressure diplomacy to the Ukrainian side to reopen the Druzhba pipeline for energy supply to Hungary, also to Slovakia. The dispute between the governments in Kiev and in Budapest is as to the technical possibility of oil flow through the pipeline. Kiev claimed that it is technically not possible due to damage of the pipeline, whereas the Budapest government said that it would be, according to the intelligence that Budapest has at its disposal. And we have no way of knowing which of the two is true. Latest that I heard, however, is that following the meeting of the Council of Foreign Ministers on Monday, Ukraine is going to reopen the Druzhba pipeline at the end of this week.
Yeah, so it suggests that there was maybe some truth in the Hungarian position, and we should also note that the Hungarian government have been saying that this was kind of calculated in some way to put extra pressure on the Hungarian government in attempt to drive up fuel prices in the run-up to the very important Hungarian election. But taking a step back in this, because this is part of a long-running dispute involving the EU, Ukraine, Hungary over the question of Russian natural resources. And ever since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there's been this move across the EU to move away from Russian natural resources. And Hungary's always stood out on this because it's kind of refused to fully abandon. It says it required them. It's part of its kind of core national interest, and given its location and geography and history, etc. But I guess my opinion is that there's quite a lot of hypocrisy over this issue of Russian resources, and that Hungary's often singled out. What's your take?
So definitely, if we look at the data, there's been a huge amount of gas coming into the ports of France and Belgium last year, and part of that was going onwards into Germany, and not only. In general, if you start looking at the details, so there is the imports in that are distributed, but then there is also a secondary market where it's using third countries, whether it's India, Azerbaijan, finding ways how the oil can get in as well. And I think there's a huge hypocrisy also on the side where there's this huge push towards centralization with the big trade deals, the autonomy of European Union, in the face of American disengagement, or at least, this kind of tensions. But then making big deal with India, making big deal with China. I don't think there is a consistency. And then I think that's why we have to look closer and not just stay on the surface, and especially where it's black and white, almost propaganda style.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting point here that over this issue, the EU is kind of, and this is something that may well have or could have even featured in one of your reports, Philip, but the EU over this issue has taken on a lot of responsibility for deciding what, up until relatively recently, would have been considered much more of a kind of a national question as to where you get your energy from. And through this issue, the EU's taken on a huge amount of power to decide and determine these kind of core questions of energy security.
Well, to take a look at the legal basis. The SAFE package, for instance, Security Act for Europe, and also other elements are based on Article 122 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. To make it short, this is the derogatory clause to the treaty. So it's a sort of an emergency powers clause in the treaties. The Commission can put forward a proposal, but it's the Council that has to adopt it, not unanimously, but in qualified majority. And you can see this is the first instance, I think, was in 2010 after the global financial crisis, but it has really been employed more frequently during the COVID pandemic. Mm-hmm. And now it is being used as an emergency powers act, if you will, for the EU policy towards Ukraine and Russia. And this is something where in matters that are core foreign policy and relate to national interest of the European states, the decisions are being taken not unanimously, as is normally the case for this policy feed, but due to this derogatory clause in qualified majority. So there is a shift which has started during the COVID years, but is perhaps going to be sort of systematic in the decisions that the Council cannot find unanimity on, even if it is in policy fields where it should have unanimity to move forward. Now, to what extent this is going to impact sanctions decisions, for instance, that is something that we are going to see throughout the next months and potentially years. But there is the way of doing business, in a way, in the Council decision-making has changed due to the use of this emergency article in the treaties.
Yeah. And Agnieszka, I was interested in response to the kind of outcry over Hungary's decision to initially block this aid package, Orban himself wrote a letter which was eventually made public, and it was really interesting, the contents of that letter. I don't know if you'd like to say something about that.
I think the response in the letter was quite clear and straightforward. It was signaling that Hungary never opposed European Union wanting to prepare this aid package. That was the decision back in December. But obviously the situation has changed, and with the oil not flowing and the refusal to restore the functioning of the pipeline, they had no other way to act but actually to secure the interests of their own nation. And one thing we have to admit that Hungary has been consistent with supporting Ukraine with the help for refugees, with giving them electricity, and that was not withdrawn even after this issue with the pipeline. And it was quite clear that we need to find a solution, but the solution that works for both sides.
I think that the diplomatic relation to Kiev is the main driver of the opposition that Hungary has to both of them. And the idea is to get Kiev to reopen the Druzhba pipeline and then to not halt the 19 billion euros loan. So this is something where essentially the Orban government would revert to the position it had in December. The 20th sanctions package, I think that might be a bit more tricky because according to the Commission's own declaration, the idea is to get, for what's in the sanction package, to get the US and other G7 economies on board and to apply what's in the sanctions package by having a broader coalition that imposes those on Russia. And up to the point where this decision was discussed earlier this week, neither the US nor other G7 economies had committed to this package of sanctions. So the EU would have had to implement them alone, which still would have had an impact, but probably also a more disproportionately negative impact on the European economy as compared to other G7 or the US economy. So I think you have to consider those two, the loan and this 20th sanctions package, from two different points of views in that regard.
Okay, so moving on, there's been a relatively momentous Supreme Court decision in the United States, which has questioned the kind of legal and executive basis of the what was slightly surprising use of tariffs that Trump employed, especially when he first came into office. And people remember this great big billboard of all these different tariff rates on different countries. And that was discussed a lot of the time. But the Supreme Court has come along and said that actually there were maybe might have overstepped the boundaries of his authority in some areas, although in other areas they affirmed his authority to make decisions with regards to tariffs. But as far as what it means for Europe, there's been some discussion that this kind of invalidates the whole basis of the trade deal that the EU and the US agreed. And certainly in the European Parliament, there's now a kind of push to restrict this. But Philipp, could you tell us a bit about what's going on and why are those in the Parliament kind of especially keen to now revisit this trade deal?
So the deal in question is the Turnberry deal of last year, which I think we've commented on here on the podcast also when it was reached, and it was conceived to be, or it was considered to be sort of a capitulation of the Commission before the Trump administration. The result now of the court ruling is that the basis that the Trump administration chose is invalid for most of the tariffs that were imposed, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. The Trump administration has already prepared for this and has moved to another legal basis. So most of the tariffs, I think, there is a global tariff of 15% based on the trade code, also Article 122 by coincidence. But this is valid for 150 days and then they have to, so it's a patch for a couple of months and then they have to come up with another idea. The flip side of this is that the basis of the agreement between the United States and the EU also is to a large extent invalidated by this, but the European Commission, first through its spokesperson and then through the Commissioner himself, has affirmed that they want to keep their end of the agreement. So this puts the Parliament into not necessarily turmoil, but into a position of unhappy feelings, and this is why the MEPs decided to suspend the procedure on this deal. What impact this really is going to have, I do not know. The mess that is the bigger mess that is currently preoccupying European companies is not so much what the European Parliament is going to say or not to say about the trade deal, but how to deal with the invalidated tariffs that have already been paid. And this is something that the Supreme Court did not hint to, is how to manage this issue. Perhaps it's also not the remit of the Supreme Court to do so. But it is the necessity of the companies to find a way to deal with the money that has already been paid. We're not quite sure where it is, how to get it back, to whom it would flow back, who would have to pay it. So the mess that has been created through this situation is considerable on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think from an economic point of view, this right now is the bigger problem than the question of the stance that the European Parliament is taking on this.
Yeah, and Agnieszka, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that despite apparently there being an opening, maybe a basis, you might say, to go and reopening this deal, there's a little appetite actually in Brussels among the Commission to go back on this. Why do you think that is?
I think there could be various reasons, but I think I can see two of them. One, it's definitely the times are not certain, and the talk around town about autonomy, European Union's autonomy from America, building our defense, this all looks great on paper, and how it's going to work, we cannot foresee that. And the other part, I think it's also they are aware that with Trump, there is always plan underneath the plan. So maybe they also a bit cautious to see what comes next, because sometimes, there is this game of putting the highest bid and then finding a third way of finding a solution on his side. So maybe they also playing on time to see what's coming next, because knowing Trump, he always wants to have the last word, and he would not want to be defeated with a situation when he looks like a loser.
And there was talk at the time, wasn't there, that the Commission was basically forced to accept the less than advantageous trade terms because of the reliance on America for the supply of weapons and aid, etc., to Ukraine. Is that still the case?
Well, to a large extent, it still is. The European defense industrial base is starting to ramp up and has increased over the past years, but is nowhere near the capacity nor the ability to commit in the way that the American defense sector is to supply Ukraine with military material. So there is a reading which is floated here around in Brussels and many European capitals that the position that the European Commission, as opposed to the Parliament, has taken is to stick to the deal to maintain the Trump administration on board with the military support for Ukraine. Now, whether this is true, I don't know. I think it's credible as an explanation, which then would lead to the question, is that a sound way to deal with the Trump administration? Because the past years and also the first Trump administration years have shown that coming from a position of weakness is not necessarily how you get to the best understanding with the Trump administration. And it's not just Trump himself, it's the administration, large parts of the administration, would rather respond to sovereignty and strength than to, the Europeans would probably say, diplomatic approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Agnieszka, despite there's been lots of claims recently that the EU is now actually taking up all of the slack in when it comes to supporting Ukraine. But if you delve a little deeper, that's not entirely true, is it?
So, of course, there's a big talk around town, but basically still relying on American weapons and supplies and also intelligence.
Finally, then, for this week, I wanted to get both your opinions on a very viral article that was published by the American Foreign Affairs website, which kicked off a huge storm because it was basically saying, and maybe correctly saying, the Europeans have got a problem with defense, number one. The Europeans, number two, have also got a problem with motivation of people to fight. Nobody wants to join the army. Recruitment rates are really low. It proposed a novel solution, which was, well, if the native population won't fight, then maybe some of the newcomers might be persuaded to join up instead. Agnieszka, what did you make of this?
First of all, I would like to stress that for the newcomers, for the migrants coming in, the carrot should be that they will get the citizenship. So in order to get the citizenship, they would have to join the army. First of all, I found it quite fascinating that people that contributed to the fact that people don't feel attachment to their own nation, the interests of their own people and the land, now they are berated for the fact that they don't want to fight to defend it. So it's like they are like punished twice, and creating this situation that defense, it's almost like a corporation. It's like, doesn't matter who is a member of the army, who's supposed to defend and whom. In a sense, it's almost like a corporation for the higher elite, that they decide who to draft and who to fight for their interest, because it's not necessarily connected with the native population.
What did you make of these suggestions for that?
Well, first of all, I found it interesting that it comes from someone who is affiliated with the New American Century think tank. So not necessarily the primary concern of having a functioning Europe, because it's a functioning America. That's their core business. It's an interesting read, creative one, I have to say. And it's one that is not necessarily without parallels in history. So the idea, going back to Roman times and probably even earlier than this, that you can become a full rights citizen of the political community through military service is one that is old, and there are valid arguments for, as there are valid arguments against it. I think for the creativity of the proposal, one of the major flaws that it has is that it comes from the European, or at least from the Western European perspective, about a decade too late. So if you would go to if you would implement the policy of obtaining citizenship through military service, this is something that you can do if you have an intake into the community which is starting. 10 years after, in fact, it's 5 years, but essentially 10 years after the migration push to Europe, and especially to Germany and France and Britain, it's hard to conceive how now you would, in any credible way, implement this idea to say, okay, you've been here for I don't know how many years, but now you can only stay if you do your military service, which, as you pointed out, something like, I don't know what, 80% of the youngsters who have been from families who have been here for generations do not want to take upon themselves. So this idea does not hold up, even though in other historical times it had a validity.
Yeah, I'm actually interested in the kind of root cause of this issue, which is, or at least the root problem is that people don't want to fight, and so or people aren't prepared to join the military. What do you think really are the causes of that more fundamental problem, Agnieszka?
I actually think that there's a difference between Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe, because actually in Poland, the return of a compulsory military service is coming back up, and not necessarily because the governing class wants people to do that. It's actually a discussion within the society, within the population. And if it was to work, how could it work? Would it be compulsory for everyone, or would it be somehow thought through based on the development of the contemporary warfare and so on and so forth? So I think this malaise, it's more common among the Western nations. And definitely there would be the fact of that for a very long time, we were told that this is really bad to be attached to your nation, to your country. All wars are bad. Even the defense war is bad. So I don't think this is a huge surprise that this is the case.
What do you make of this? Obviously, in Germany, there's been a lot of discussion over this question of return of national service or conscription. What do you think is at the root of this problem?
The idea over decades that we live in a happy supranationalism as embodied by the European Union means that the commitment to the national community, especially the national militaries, because this is the military that exists in Europe, is somehow obsolete. So I think that to go in the time frame of, let's say, the last generation and the famous end of history as written by Fukuyama, I think the mindset has still taken hold, still has a hold in society beyond 2022 when the Russian attack on Ukraine occurred. Is something that the mentality, the broader mentality shifts only slowly. And I think that this habit of the happy post-Cold War years and the end of history is one element of the explanation. Another one is the dissatisfaction with public policy as implemented at the European and at many national levels by the governments. And this is something which there's a broader societal and political shift happening in Europe, and we are still in the midst of this shift. So the alignments and the loyalties are less clear than they were 20 years ago, and then they are perhaps going to be 20 years from now. But right now, this is a situation where this type of commitment is something which is considered to be rather untypical. And you can even see it in the professional militaries, because the last number that I read is that, again, Western Europe I'm not sure how Central and Eastern Europe play in this, but in Western Europe, the professional militaries have somewhere between 15 and 20% understaffed numbers compared to what they want to achieve, and not necessarily what they plan to achieve, but that they want to achieve because they have to have the numbers within 12 months or 18 months.
Yeah, I'm interested in this question because I saw a comparison that was raised that people don't want to fight for their country when their country is so associated with, or at least the governing classes are so associated with values that feel quite alien to them, and that there's a recent history of fighting, you might say, pointless wars abroad for no particular reason, and then only coming back home to see that your government's kind of responding to that sacrifice by opening the borders and putting kind of ideological craziness in your schools, etc., etc. And I saw a comparison that said, you might struggle to get people to sign up to the military, but imagine if the government put out a call to who wanted people to walk and police the borders. You probably have quite a few people signing up.
That's true. Actually, in Poland, last year, for many months, actually, people were organizing themselves to stand on the border and protect and detect any illegal movement there. So yeah, I agree with you.
So thanks. That's all we've got time for this week on the MCC Brussels podcast. Do join us next week at the same time. If you enjoyed the podcast, please share it with all your friends. You can share it on various different social formats that we're around on. You can leave us a comment as ever on YouTube. We do read them all, even if we don't have time always to respond to them. But there's some excellent responses to our last podcast. So thank you very much. For now, thanks and see you next week.